Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. This may be the fastest turnaround for a guest for two separate books that we've ever done. It's pretty impressive. But listeners may recall Robert Kagan was on here for to talk about his wonderful book, which I learned an enormous amount from, Ghost at the Feast. He's a muckety-muck scholar of foreign policy stuff and of history, and he's at the Brookings Institution, and he's got a new book out called Rebellion: How Anti-Liberalism is Tearing America Apart Again. Robert, welcome back to the Remnant.
Great to be here. Thanks, Jonah.
Okay, so as we were talking about in the green room, we're going to have some disagreements, but we'll also have a lot of agreement, and we'll just see how it goes. But let's start with the classic, the trademark first question of this podcast when we have authors on. What's your book about?
Well, it's basically an attempt to explain to me, myself at least, why there are so many people willing to support someone who is so evidently a threat to the American liberal democratic system. And so in my sort of tendency as a historian, I decided to go back and look at what I felt might be the roots of this. And so I tried to trace the roots of it. Obviously, you have, as is so often the case in history, you have the intersection of a unique individual with a historical movement that has already been present, and it's the conjunction of those two things which creates change and something in some cases that's quite unexpected. There's many times in history when we can imagine that, when we know that these kinds of conjunctions occurred, and this is one of them for the United States.
Yeah, so let's sort of start there. I think the best parts of the book where I am in violent agreement with you is on the radical nature. You're sort of you've written a lot about this on your own, and you've had lots of original thinking, but you're sort of also sort of an expander of the Gordon Wood thing, that the American founding was this radical thing, and sort of and new in the world, and not foreordained or inevitable, which I agree with you on as well. So what are you talking about anti-liberalism as it emerges from the emergence of liberalism?
Right. I mean, anti-liberalism is a real ideology that needs to be taken seriously, in the sense that it is a defense of tradition, of a number of traditions, religious traditions, hierarchies in society, that liberalism is inherently tends to erode, and I wouldn't say that liberalism is hostile to traditions, but it certainly has a corrosive effect on traditions, and that from the beginning, whether people have articulated it as some did, like Demaitre in France and others, or simply felt it, there's always been a counter resistance to wherever liberalism has arisen. There's been an attack on liberalism on perfectly reasonable grounds, that it is disrupting all of our traditions and disrupting our hierarchies, which gets into the way our families operate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the founders were, I think, acutely aware of this. In the book, I quote Benjamin Rush saying, "We've changed our form of government and the principles on which that government is based. But the question is, have we changed our own actual habits?" And of course, the answer certainly was no, including for the author of the Declaration of Independence himself. So that's kind of what, and so this tension has always existed. It has led to civil war. It has led to other kinds of military conflict. It's been a constant source of tension. And I think what we're seeing is the eruption, a rebellion against the pervasive liberalism of our society by those who are unhappy with its consequences.
Okay, so I mean, this sort of, I don't want to jump to the disagreements, but your explanation of what anti-liberalism and liberalism is right then, you said anti-liberalism is in effect, the sort of expression of counter-enlightenment thought, like, is it Demaist? I can never figure out how to pronounce it. Demaist? Anyway, famous counter-enlightenment, ultramontane Catholic thinker, ultra-traditionalist type in France. And that's obviously one form of anti-liberalism. I don't dispute that in the slightest. But there are forms of anti-liberalism that are not grounded in a critique of defending tradition and the established order and altar and throne, right? I mean, there's a lot of anti-liberalism in Marxism and positivism and critical theory and all of these sorts of things. So is your definition of anti-liberalism, because from, I had to go through the book fairly quickly when I got it. Is your definition of liberal, I gather your definition of liberalism is essentially the spirit of the Declaration, all men are created equal, and basically the Bill of Rights and those propositions. But is anti-liberalism for you simply something that comes from the ultra-traditionalist?
No.
Is there...
Right. There is certainly an anti-liberalism on the left, and I didn't write a history of anti-liberalism. Otherwise, I would have written a history of anti-liberalism on the left, which, as you correctly identify, is Marx. But on the other hand, as you know, Marx and liberalism share certain commonalities. It's complicated, and in any case, in the American context, despite what people especially conservatives often say, the threat to liberalism has, in my view, and this is maybe exactly what we should be arguing about, Jonah, has never really come from the left as much as from the right. And so, and by the anti-liberal right, I mean the South is an anti-liberal right? It's not a Marxist. It's not a Marxist critique of liberalism, and so that whole tradition, I would say that the sort of white Christian nationalism is on the right, not on the left. So that while there is a threat from the left, and I think we can talk about what's happening on the universities, right, and has been happening in the universities for decades. First of all, that is not the anti-liberalism that Trump is dealing with. And in my view, and we can again argue about this, I just don't think that anti-liberalism has been the threat that some people think it is in the United States.
Right. I mean, I'm a little bit like the drunk who looks for his car keys with a light is good. I like the intellectual arguments, and the sort of the Jesuitical definitional hair splitting on a lot of these things. But I just to point out, I agree with you that there's a anti-liberal tradition on the right, traditionalist right, whatever we're going to call it. But when you say like Marx and liberalism have a complicated relationship and they share some commonalities, so does the traditionalist right and liberalism. I mean, you know this better than I do, that and you write about it in the book, that the revolutionary generation was pressing for what they considered their traditional ancient rights as British people, right? I mean, American liberalism emerges in no small part out of a traditionalist culture that comes from England or the Anglosphere, however we're going to call it. That's a commonality there too, which is just to say that it's nuanced on both sides. It's not just like if you're a defender of tradition, you are against everything that is about liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, look, I and this may be, maybe I've gone too far with this, but I actually have sort of gone out of my way in the book to try to separate what happened at the founding from the English tradition, as you know. And so, I either successfully or unsuccessfully make the case that, this is what America became was not where Britain was headed. And it wasn't just because the British did not, whatever, Locke was British, okay, but the British system was not Lockean, and it was not based on a principle of universal natural rights. It was based on the theory of the rights of Englishmen. So, yes, and the rights of Englishmen had meaning that did, evolve under certain circumstances, but it's the circumstances that allowed them to evolve, I guess is what I would say. It's not obvious to me. And this is we could argue about this, and I'm sure people will want to have argued about this. It's not obvious to me that had there been no America, no discovery of America, that England would have evolved to become a system based on natural rights as the Americans did. So you really needed the American experience. So in that respect, clearly they are inheriting ideas from a tradition, but it is not a straight line from the English tradition to the American system, and you really do need, again, a radical break. Now, my definition of radical, I think, is slightly different from Gordon Wood's definition of radical, and we could get into that, but I'm sure your listeners don't want to hear about it.
I'm
But
sure
anyway,
some do, but we don't need to right now.
but in any case, that's where I guess I might differ, and I am trying to
Yeah.
make the point that this is something really was a break from where England was going.
I don't dispute that at all. I mean, like, I'm a big believer that there was an American Enlightenment, an English Enlightenment, a Scottish, a French. The German one sucked. You know, there are all sorts of different Enlightenments. I'm sort of with Gertrude, Himmelfarb on that. But at the same time, I don't think you disagree, and maybe we have to get into this because it'd be fascinating to me if you didn't. If you did disagree, if North America had been settled by Spaniards or Russians, you don't get the American Revolution either. Right?
No, right. Oh, absolutely. And so, yeah,
Right.
if we let's agree on that. And if we can agree that nevertheless it was the peculiar circumstances both of the revolution and of the land situation took those things and changed them into something that was more radical, let's just say, on the individual rights scale than where Britain was headed. Then we're good.
I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
That the founders reified and systematized a bunch of cultural norms that they plucked out like oysters and turned into fully developed different things. I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
Okay. So
so we're done?
No, we're not done. I'm sorry. I mean, it's very strange. It's an awkward thing for me because, like, I share with you, I am not fully on board your Trump will be a dictator thing. But I share your antipathy for Trump, right? I have the scars to prove I am not a Trump guy. And I think the people who want to reject your argument out of hand, that he, sort of the hard Kagan argument that he will be a dictator or that he will try to be a dictator, they miss the point that even if you're wrong, you're probably somewhere between 10% and 90% off, which means that there is a significant chance you're right. And the way we normally do risk assessment in life is, if I tell you you only have a 1 in 10 chance of that elevator crashing to the ground and killing you, you don't get on the elevator, right? If I tell you there's a 1 in 100 chance that flight will crash, you don't get on the plane. That's, it's like Dick Cheney's, 1% thing, with nuclear weapons and terrorists. And so people think that just because they disagree with you on the maximum prediction, they think they can dismiss entirely the minor one. So I'm with you on a lot of that stuff. I'm with you on. I've been going hammer and tongs about Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule for a very long time. I think what they're doing is terrible. But I guess it's the ghost at the feast. We might as well just get to the disagreement and we can circle back to the other stuff. I think your treatment of the conservative movement after World War II is otherworldly and wrong. And I just disagree with it. I think you get it wrong.
Okay.
But I don't want to be unfair. So I'd like you to make your case for what you think, how you think the American conservative movement, led by Buckley, represented by Reagan and that crowd, how it was representative of the anti-liberalism of the Confederacy, the anti-liberalism of Trump, of Deneen, however you want to make it. Take as long as you like, make your case, and then we can just have it out.
Okay, that's fair. Listen, and by the way, the conservative movement. I'm not, I don't ever say the conservative movement. Okay,
Sure.
I do. Obviously, there are different strains of conservatism, and I grew up, or I came of age, in that world, and so I accepted then the premise. I think it's Harvey Mansfield has said it, but any number of other people have said it. I guess Lewis Hart said it too, which is that the only conservatism in America is the conservatism that's aimed at preserving the liberalism of the founding. Okay, so there are, and I believe there are such people. I mean, I feel like I knew such people. They were interested in preserving the principles of the founding against various kinds of, again, I think we should be frank, fundamentally Marxist, intellectual, I don't know what to say, distortions or etc. of that, and that was the conservative movement. Okay, but of course, as we've discovered, and I'll work backwards. I discovered that a lot of the people who I thought were that are diehard Trump supporters. So I said, that's a contradiction. I don't understand the contradiction. Okay. I don't know how you go from being a conservative of the founders' liberalism to being a supporter of Donald Trump, given what he evidently is. Not to mention a supporter of Donald Trump's movement, therefore, by extension, which is also very much, powerful forces in his movement are anti-liberal. So then you want to say, well, okay, so what happened, and as I go back, and then you go back and you have to, I know you don't want to say Bill Buckley and the Confederacy, but you do have to deal with, and I'm not saying, I know you do deal with the fact that the original sort of National Review position, in the late 1950s and early 1960s was frankly pro-segregationist, frankly anti-Board v. education, right? And so I know that Buckley later apologized, just the way Robert Byrd later apologized for being a member of the Klan. Do I think that Robert Byrd was a completely different man after he apologized than before he apologized? So, then you have to go back and say, if Buckley's conservatism, as he articulated it, began and therefore was fundamentally wrapped up in the defense of the South, at the very least, because I don't know what Buckley was personally I'm not saying Buckley was a racist, but he was definitely defending the South on very, by the way, traditional conservative, and I mean Burkean conservative grounds, which is, hey, they have their traditions, and so you can't be imposing your abstract liberal principles on them. And what he really was, but again, without saying it, the abstract principles he was referring to were the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and so therefore, you start with that. And of course, as you know, there's always been a very complicated relationship in conservatism between the small government conservatism and the states' rights anti-desegregationist conservatism. And so I decided that it was looking a lot more to me like what Buckley was doing was pulling together strands of old school anti-liberal conservatism, modernizing them for a new audience, and becoming and creating something which then I think and marrying up to something which was legitimate, by the way, which was the concern about the expansion of the administrative state in the New Deal, et cetera, and wrapping that all together. But I really feel like the core of it was a traditionalist conservatism. And by the way, the prominence of Burke, by the way, who was pro-American Revolution, and I think understood the difference between the American system and the British system. But nevertheless, when you say Burke and the accretion of tradition, I'm saying that is anti-liberal in the American context. And so I think, that's not the whole story. And as we push back and forth, I'm sure I can get out more of it. But that's a quick summary.
Okay, so we'll start with the Buckley stuff. I mean, we'll start with the Buckley stuff. I was at National Review for 21 years. I must have written 2 dozen times. Buckley was wrong about all of that. It's not just that he apologized like Robert Byrd apologized. I mean, he had a full evolution on these issues. Maybe he didn't evolve to the state of enlightenment that you would have liked to have, but he wrote many, many, many columns supporting the Voting Rights Act. I mean, he came around on a lot of this stuff. Nor was National Review monolithically all on the South must prevail horrible editorial note. That was a terrible thing that National Review did. Brent Bozell chastised him for writing it. There was internal dissent about these things. But the idea, the sort of broad brushstroke idea that Bill was primarily driven about the race stuff. I'm not saying it was a minor part of his thought, but there's reading a lot of your treatment about a lot of conservatives. I feel like Ronald Reagan saying, "Where's the rest of me?" Right? I mean, Bill went to work almost immediately going after anti-Semites. you have this weird thing where you sort of conflate National Review conservatism and the Birchers, but they hated each other. And Bill went hammer and tongs at the Birchers. Uh, National Review declared that if you wrote for the American Mercury, you couldn't write for National Review. There were all sorts of old right anti-Semite cranks who were not allowed to write for National Review. And so I just think there's a fuller picture of Bill where you can say was wrong about this very important thing, but even invoking Burke, who was a Whiggish liberal, a Burkean defense of something is not an absolutist defense. It is not a tyrannical defense. It is by definition, because it's Burke, a fairly nuanced contextual defense that he was wrong about again. But moving beyond that, I don't get how, I'll just put it into simpler terms. You call originalism, constitutional originalism, anti-liberal. I cannot get my head around it. Can you explain how that can be the case?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bald statement. I'm not a legal scholar, and I didn't write a legal treatise. But this gets to the Buckley question too, and I understand where you're coming from. And again, I didn't try to write a history that This is gonna be my thing. I didn't try to write a history of this, and I didn't write a history of that. So I didn't write a history of the conservative. I didn't write a history of the conservative movement either. And all its many trajectories. But I'm sorry. What was the question?
How is originalism anti-liberal?
Right. So, in the sense that if you say if you base what you're making your judgment on what the founders did at the time, or even how they saw the world at the time on these rights issues, it's important. I feel that negates the fact that the founders themselves knew that how they were living and how the society was at the time was not in conformance with those principles. And therefore, you can't just go and say, well, that's how they were living at the time. They didn't have gay marriage back in the 18th century, and therefore there's no right for gay marriage. I think if you are clear about what the founders were saying, it was they themselves had not realized that a natural right was being violated at that time because of their social, etc. And there were many issues on which they knew that was already true, setting aside the issues that they didn't even imagine. That I have this quotation from John Adams, of all people, who you don't expect to find, saying, yeah, the next thing you know, the women are going to be asking for their rights, and these people are going to be asking for their rights. And he didn't say, and we're going to stop it, God damn it. What he basically was saying was, yeah, we've opened up this situation, which is going to lead to a lot of people demanding their rights, and so that's what's happened, and so that's why I would say, and more of these decisions, to say originalism these days, I understand what a thicket I'm walking into, because there's 15 different types of originalism too, but when these justices do say and do ground their decisions in practices of the time, that is anti-liberal in the context of the American founding, because the founders themselves knew that you could not simply pursue their principles and understand the principles according to the way they were behaving at the time.
Okay, so I think this is getting us closer and closer to my fundamental issue. I may disagree with it, but I have zero problem analytically, conceptually, logically with someone who says originalism is wrong. Okay? And for many of the reasons you say. Now, again, I have my arguments, as I think it's largely right, for, in some ways, procedural reasons, but totally opens the argument that it's wrong. And I think, I don't think you're related, but Justice Kagan is very good at sort of sticking it to the originalists by being an originalist and a progressive. And I find it very enjoyable and interesting. But I do not understand how you can say that a movement dedicated to enshrining that describes itself, that its own conception of itself is that they are trying to preserve and defend the liberal principles and rules of the constitutional order in this liberal revolution that we both agree was very, very liberal and very, very new, and that they are defenders of this liberal revolution, that because they're analytically wrong, that means they are anti-liberal. I mean, you're not going to find a lot of quotes from originalists saying they are against liberalism, which means that you are imposing a label on them that they don't accept. Now, Deneen and Vermeulen, who are absolutely anti-liberal, say it. But you call Justice Scalia an anti-liberal. I don't get it. I just flatly don't get it. And that's not to say you can't be wrong. He was wrong about some things, but he wouldn't consider himself anti-liberal. And so it's the imposition of a label that people going to Buckley, right? But all these guys, Reagan, you suggest is anti-liberal.
No, I put Reagan in the liberal Republican in the liberal conservative category. I think I don't say that. I do think
okay,
that
if I missed that line, I could have sworn I read it, but I grant you it's your book, so that's fine.
His administration had anti-liberal elements to it. Yes, that I do agree. And he also brought what I call anti-liberal conservatism back to power within his orbit for the first time. That's all I would say. But Reagan
Okay.
himself,
But
I
anyway,
don't think.
my only point
Yeah,
is the people who call themselves conservative and
yeah,
originalists, right?
yeah.
And traditional, they consider themselves
I know.
liberal in the American tradition, and so you're imposing upon them a label that they wouldn't embrace, and ascribing to them views that I don't think they have. You're totally fair on Deneen and Vermeulen, because they're saying let's get rid of liberalism, but it's just not how the conservatives I grew up around conceived of themselves. And and you can say they're wrong about all sorts of things, but I don't think you can say this is an effervescence of actual philosophically coherent anti-liberalism if the people pushing it don't believe that that's what they're pushing.
Well, I don't know how well to, I don't know what's in people's minds. What I noticed that, Justice Neil Gorsuch talks about the so-called separation of church and state. I don't know what that means in this context. When I read the decisions, especially by or dissents in some cases, especially by Clarence Thomas and Alito, they are heavily grounded in historical context. And I think that there is you could say that this is a theory divorced from a purpose, but very few theories are divorced from a purpose. And so I think I know what the purpose is. Now I can't, I'm not, if we could go through and talk about every conservative I've ever met and that you've ever met and try to label them according to where I think they stand on these issues. But again, there are a lot of Americans, as you know, and I know that I'm not trying to cast aspersions by bringing this up, but there are, most Americans who are a part of the Trump movement think they are the super patriots. They are the ones who were really doing what the founders wanted, because, of course, we know the founders wanted a Christian nation. You know what I mean? So I know people. It's rare to come out against the founders. That's why people like Vermeulen and Deneen, get the attention that they do. But I think, and I guess this is what I'm saying, I would like it to be demonstrated to me why it isn't the case that they are fundamentally expressing what is underneath all of this, and I guess that's unfair. And I mean, you're saying that's unfair. And if it's unfair, I would love to see more conservatives expressing their hostility to this anti-liberalism, instead of what I mostly see is conservatives saying that Joe Biden is a communist and the end of humanity as we know it. So
we're in violent agreement on that.
I know you are, and
completely with you. Yeah.
That's not aimed at you. But what I'm saying
No, I
is,
know.
At this point, I will tell you quite honestly, I guess the most honest thing I could say is, having experienced what I've experienced and having seen and I'll use the term because these people are neoconservatives, become hardcore Trump supporters. I have to, if you had said to me, who is obviously devoted to the conservation of liberalism, I would have said the neoconservatives of the 1960s and 70s, because after all, and we know why too, also, by the way.
Right.
So if they now are with this same movement, I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you believe in. So I'm willing to say, of course, that it's unfair to paint the conservative movement with a single brush and to condemn people for what with a single sentence. And I'd be happy to argue this out. And I understand where you're coming from, and I expected this response. And so maybe I'm being deliberately provocative and challenging conservatives to say, no, 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 we really do believe in the principles, and it's not what it looks like.
Yeah. So again, obviously, I am sympathetic with a lot of that. So let me do it. Let me do it this way. And the reason why I think this stuff matters, rather than me just sort of defending my tribe or any of that kind of stuff, is that I think your theory of the case of how we got Trump is very different than my theory of the case of how we got Trump.
Okay.
And it's first of all, it's not as monocausal as the reaction of anti-liberalism going back 250 years. That's obviously part of it. I think you're right about that. But I think that what begets anti-liberalism or illiberalism, or we'll stick with anti-liberalism, help move the book, is anti-liberalism. And I think that the craziness that we've seen on the right, I mean, there are other things going on. There's weird celebrity culture and cult of personality stuff and catastrophization on the right. That's all part of the dysfunction. But part of the cause of it, and you can see it in real time, one of the sustainers of support for Trump is the sense that the other side doesn't have to obey the rules, so we shouldn't either. And if you go back, like, I mean, I always give myself a hard time about this. My first book, I talked about the role of Saul Alinsky on the left, but I talked about, and maybe I exaggerated it, and I'm open to that charge, but I talked about Saul Alinsky as being a bad person, like bad influence on the left, and I'm part of the cause of that getting incepted on the right. But what happened on the right is I watched it mutate, and it started as, look how terrible the left is because they're Alinskyites, to look, the left always wins because they're Alinskyites, so we have to be Alinskyites too. And I think that's what's happened with people like Dinesh, who's lost his mind. It's happened with a lot of these guys, is all they see on the left is illiberalism or anti-liberalism. And they say, look, these guys win because they're anti-liberals. We have to stop playing by the rules and do the same thing. And that's what the argument you get from Deneen and Vermeulen. It's the argument you get from this kid, Josh Hammer. It's the argument you get from a lot of the openly anti-liberal people, is that liberalism has failed to win for us. So we have to stop playing by these rules and Kobayashi Maru the liberal project. And that's why my fundamental disagreement is that you really just sort of dismiss the idea that there's a lot of illiberalism or anti-liberalism on the American left. And I think it's the illiberalism of the American left that sort of in a dialectical fashion brings out the illiberalism on the American right. It's not the liberalism of it, it's the illiberalism. That's my thesis. Feel free to whack away.
Right. And I look, that is the other thesis, and I accept, and I know that exists. And the problem of responding to it is that you'd have to parse through so many things to talk about what's illiberal and what isn't illiberal. So, when it gets to things like gay rights and other rights issues, which is often taken as progressive lunacy and therefore put up as the excuse for why we can't let the system operate anymore. I'm sorry. That is the founder system working its way through the system, and you may not like it, but that just is the way you need another system if you don't like it. You know what I mean? So therefore, I don't. And since so much of what I consider to be liberalism working its way through the system is precisely what is driving the right crazy, as it always has. And this is the other thing. I mean, there is this, we're all conscious of this. And by the way, me growing up as in the age that I grew up in, my instinct is to be more sympathetic with you. You know what I mean? I'm not thrilled with what's happening on university campuses. My father has been yelling about this stuff for 40 years, already. And so, but nevertheless, I still have to recognize that, and this is not for the campuses, but on these other questions, I'm sorry, this is the way liberalism is playing itself out in our system. And I'm sorry, what I was going to say was, it isn't just that now things have really gone off the rails, because the same exact arguments that liberalism was going too far or it's anti-liberal or what have you were being made in the civil rights era. They were being made at previous times. So, I have to take some of this with a grain of salt. Now, are there areas in which I think a real the academy has really now become a heartland of anti-liberalism from the left. And
Mm-hmm.
if I had the luxury of being upset about only the anti-liberalism on the left in the universities, I would consider myself a happy man. Those are the days I would love to go back to. But I really, in the context of the liberalism that's under attack in a meaningful way that could really take the anti-liberal forces that could really take power next year. That's what's got my attention.
Yeah.
And so I want to say, I get that you're pissed off about this and that and this excess, and I could also list all the excesses that I'm also pissed off about. But we're adults here, and so we get back to your initial thing that we both agree on, which is the risk equation. We're not going to die. The country's not going to go down because the left is out of control on the campuses right now. But it could go down because Donald Trump's going to get elected next year. So get your priorities straight. And I believe me, I'm not going back to Germany so that I can talk about Hitler. But if you go back to Weimar Germany, conservative businessmen and other conservatives who supported the Nazi movement because they were afraid of the communists, the communists in those days were actually in the streets. They were armed. They were killing people. I mean, there was a real civil war going on at that time. And so, we don't have a lot of sympathy for those conservative businessmen now. But now, so what is it that's happening that requires us to go to the extreme measure of re-electing Donald Trump? That's basically where I am.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I mean, one of the things, and it must drive you crazier than me, given your muckety-muck historian status, is the recency bias going on the right and on the left is just mind-boggling. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I see people saying, well, campus protests started in 1968 at Columbia. And I'm like, the first campus protest in this country was at Harvard before the American Revolution. It was the Fish Rebellion or something like that. I mean, like, Alexander Hamilton negotiated the riots to get, the provost of Columbia, which is then King's College. I mean, like, campus unrest is a thing, right? So,
I know. They're like, the country's on fire. It's falling apart. Chaos. And it's like student protest.
Right. Well, and also, like, the way we talk about crime in this country. Crime right now is not great, and it's big, but it's getting better. At the margins, and the homicide rates coming. But like, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s. Crime has been worse in this country.
But can I just say this really gets to a key point, Jonah, which is a question I genuinely have for you. Okay. Everything you're saying is true, and I think any sensible person could say. So when I see someone like Bill Barr say, having said that, yes, Trump is a potential dictator, and yes, he's a disaster, and yes, he's unfit to be president, but a Biden victory is just it'll be the end of the country. Now, I personally do not believe that any part of Bill Barr's brain believes that. And yet, that is the thing that Chris Sununu says. Everybody who comes out for Trump, no matter what they ever said about Trump, says Biden is the end of the world. Now, you and I know that that's not absurd. So, that is absurd. So what is going on?
So it's a great question. It is one of the running questions of this podcast, going back many years, of were they always crazy or did they become crazy? Right. And I don't think Barr is crazy. I do think, Sununu makes more sense to me. I don't like it, but Sununu wants to run for office again. His political career is not over, and so he's got to eat crow, right? Or some other material. And I cannot, for the life of me, figure out why Barr just doesn't say, I said all I had to say in my book and be done with it. Like, he's not going to be attorney general ever again. He's not going to run for office.
I assume it's money. I assume it's got to be money or social status or something.
I think it's I think the most intoxicating thing for a lot of people is relevance. The
Yeah.
idea of, I mean, it's something of a real tell I get when I will DM with people, or text or talk to people, out of the public eye and I'll give them a hard time for one thing or another, Trump related or attacking the dispatch or whatever. And it's amazing how many of them will say, you're just bitter because you're not relevant anymore. And I find
Right.
that to be a tell about
Yeah,
what they
yeah, yeah.
value,
Well, by the
right?
way, and that's why I push back a little bit on the left drove Dinesh D'Souza crazy. I mean, you can't tell me that a lot of people like Laura Ingraham and others realized that there's big money here, baby. I mean, if you start
Sure.
spouting the right stuff, there's big payoff for a journalist, for someone who writes for a living. My goodness.
Yeah, but again, I think, I mean, I don't want to go full Hofstadter on you, but I think it's the status stuff more than it is the money. Because like
Okay. All right.
Sean,
I like that.
Sean Hannity already has enough money that he only flies private, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he would dry up like a piece of dog crap and blow away if he couldn't be on TV every day. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
who they are, right? And I
Okay.
think
Fair
so.
enough.
Staying in
Fair
the
enough.
mix. So, but this gets back to our point: is that I don't know that it makes them anti-liberal. It makes them all sorts of craven bad things. But like if the incentive structure were to be liberal, they would be liberal as long as they
No,
got
no,
to
no.
stay on TV.
And let me be clear on that. And again, I understand perfectly well that first of all, there's a whole professional Republican class that has to say what it has to say, and therefore I'm not attributing any particular views to them. I'm more interested in sort of in the average Republican voter who did happily
Mhm.
vote for Mitt Romney, did happily vote for John McCain, and is now happily voting for Donald Trump. So
Right.
again, you have to say, well, what's going on here? So yeah, I don't think they not only have been not anti-liberal, that they have, as you say, gone along entirely with the liberal order up until now. They weren't screaming about the uniparty. So the only explanation I have, though, because there's two ways of looking at it. They simply don't believe there's a problem, and therefore they're not worried about it. Or they do believe there's a problem, and they're not worried about it.
Right. No, that's right. I think that's
Right?
fair for
And
sure. Yeah.
so I used to be very much in the first camp, that they just don't understand that there's a problem, and therefore they're not worried about it. And I have, over the past year, shifted to the second view more predominantly, which is that they do know that there's a problem, they do know that there's a risk, and they think they're going to be okay. And that's where I feel like that's where I'm not talking about them being actively anti-liberals, but for having insufficient commitment to liberalism to want to defend it against an obvious threat. And that's why I start quoting, Abraham Lincoln in the Lyceum speech, and Thomas
Hmm.
Jefferson in Notes on Virginia, where they are saying, gee, I'm not sure the American people have got it anymore when it comes to actually being committed to these principles. And we don't accept, because we're so hyper enlightenment in our approach to everything. It doesn't occur to us that the American people, at a very broad level, could lose their sense of how important liberalism is, and
Hmm.
just not value it very much. And we know that the left has been in a constant assault on liberalism in the academy, and it really has filtered into the school system. And then, of course, there's, as I think is true, there's always been this traditionalist, chiefly right wing hostility to liberalism. But I mean, I think the fairest thing to say, that I should say, and talking to you, is that it certainly is a combination of the two. But the net
Hmm.
result is that liberalism is not something that American people are jumping to defend.
I agree with that. But this raises and sort of a meta question for you. Who are you trying to persuade? Because it seems in your book, right? Because it seems to me, and look, I'm not trying to be preachy about this. My first book was pretty red meaty. My second book was pretty partisan, or by my standards at least. And my third book, I decided I need to start modeling the behavior that I think is lacking in here, and try to persuade people to my left that I disagree with by arguing on their terms and trying to bring them along. And I think there's a lot of that's missing out there. And so, but when I read this, if the problem is that conservatives are betraying what they believe to be their principles, well, sort of the MSNBC audience believes that. They love pointing out the hypocrisy. They like hearing that it's all really about white supremacy and all of these kinds of things. But it's kind of bringing coals to Newcastle. You're not like convinced. I mean, maybe you're convincing some reluctant Biden voter out there. But if I'm a on the bubble sort of conservative who maybe voted for Trump in 2016, but not in 2020, and now I'm agonizing about it because I'm kind of like a Bill Barr type and I whatever. And I read like, oh, okay, so the people who think Trump's going to be a dictator also think that all of this stuff for the last 200 years has been about white supremacy and conservatives are racists and all that. Who is the target audience? Who are you trying to bring around? And is this the argument to make to bring them around? Or is it just, as you said, you're trying to understand it yourself and this is the explanation you could come up with for yourself?
I mean, it's definitely the latter. I mean, I'm not. I have no. I was asked this. I've been asked this directly. You know, did you write this in a way to try to persuade the people you disagree with? And the answer is definitely, obviously, I did. As your reaction indicates, the answer is definitely not. And I don't think I didn't make a lot of concessions to try to make people feel better. Partly, I got to tell you, I'll be honest, from a kind of writing and argument point of view. If I really had put all the things in the book that would have made everybody feel better about themselves, I don't know what would have been left. I mean, we're having this conversation in part because I put things rather starkly. But sometimes I think it's helpful to put things starkly. And yeah, you can find the ways in which it's not right. But how do you persuade anybody? Jonah, I got to tell you, if I felt that I knew what the right way to persuade these people was, I would be jumping for it. I feel like almost pretty much everybody is at this point unpersuadable. And you know, when I do see people who have publicly stated and we're very confident believe that Trump is a real danger to the country, saying, "But I'm going to support him anyway." I'm sorry, what argument am I supposed to use with that person?
That's fair. That's fair.
That person is pursuing their interests as they perceive them. They clearly are not engaged in a discussion of ideas. And so I just feel like at least let's know a big part of what's going on here and face up to it.
Okay, so I mean, again, and I am not a typical reader because I bring a lot of my priors to the page, right? But if I were going to write a history of anti-liberalism in America, starting with the reaction to the American founding, because you know, you say you put some things starkly that or strongly that offend some people, and you do, right? You do, but you also put some things softly, which is part of my problem. You know, it's like you're very hard on I think you're too hard on some of the conservatives. Not all the conservatives. Again, some of them were bad and wrong and all that. But I think you're way too soft on a lot of the progressives, right? And I think we should use progressive rather than liberal here because it'll get confusing.
Although I will charge the conservative historians that I know of really messing up what progressivism means by insisting on linking it to Theodore Roosevelt's progressivism. But let's and Woodrow Wilson's progressivism. But you know, just as a footnote there.
All right, well, let's not do the footnote. I mean, I think I mentioned this before. I am the international vice chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Haters Association.
No, I know.
So,
you are.
So what you seem to intimate that Wilson and FDR were liberal in the tradition of the American founding to some extent, right? And so, if I were writing the history of
I don't think I say that about Wilson. After all, I don't really think I say that about Wilson in domestic policy. No. But anyway,
okay. All right. So part of my problem with trying to tease out the thesis when I'm reading this is that it often feels like sort of welfare state, quote unquote welfare state liberalism is often synonymous with liberalism,
right?
In your telling. And
no. I really go out of my way at one point to define exactly what I mean about liberalism, and I specifically say, and this is where I should interrupt you. Why don't you finish your point, and then I'll finish.
Oh no, let's do that then. I'm all about defining terms. So
okay, all right.
What do you mean by liberalism? What do you mean by, and how is okay, go ahead. Just define your terms.
So I do say specifically that the founders, I believe, had their own preferences about how the economy should be organized and what the government's role in the economy should be, but none of them were anti-liberal. Okay, so you could be a Hamiltonian, which is, I
Mhm.
think, arguably the forerunner of progressivism, certainly of Theodore Roosevelt's progressivism, and say the government needs to be involved in the economy for the following reasons, and so that we can maintain so that the wealthy class stays committed to it, et cetera, all for the purpose of preserving liberalism. And Thomas Jefferson can say, no, we should be supporting the yeoman farmer in the interest of preserving liberalism. So what I object to, and this is something that I blame, I don't know, defenders of liberalism, who want to envelop in liberalism the nature of our economy. Because,
Mhm.
and this is where things get complicated, or one of the many places things get complicated, some of them are ultimately Marxist in their orientation and do want to have what is effectively a socialist common property thing, which is utterly antithetical to what the founders wanted. Okay, so, uh, but but the argument as to whether you have more government or less government is not necessarily about liberalism. And I take seriously the argument that you've made, and that, like Paul Ray has made, about soft despotism, that yes, it could get to be to the point where the administrative state gets to be so big that you really are, in some way, people are sort of losing their liberties. I take that seriously. Just to drive in the knife here, what I find ironic then, for the people who've been making the soft despotism argument all along, not to be concerned about the hard despotism
Sure.
threat that is right next to us, but also the fact that I don't think that Trump conservatives anymore are anti-state. They just want to control the state instead of having liberals control it, right? So, that also raises questions to my mind about what this American conservatism is supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, so like one of the dogs that doesn't bark in here is that, I mean, I reading it on my Kindle, the word libertarian doesn't show up, Hayek doesn't show up, right? And Hayek was a big champion of liberalism.
Right.
Maybe he focused too much on economics for your taste on it, but like he certainly was. And
But
Irving Kristol
Hayek was
used to,
not
yeah,
universally beloved among conservatives ultimately, right? Partly for that reason.
yeah, but
Anyway,
neither is Russell Kirk. And you elevated Russell Kirk, and like I've been popping and scatting on Russell Kirk for 40 years now. I mean, like there are debates on the right about a lot of these guys.
look,
Um,
I'm going to admit right here, I danced my way through I did not do the full exposition of all these different things. I admit it,
sure,
because I just feel like at the end of the day, I'm trying to make a point, and it's a point that we should argue about.
fair. No, that's fair. But
Yeah.
so my point would be that um so Irving Kristol used to say, there are two strains within conservatism, broadly speaking. The people who are anti-left and people who are anti-state. And we call the libertarians anti-state, and they are, obviously. But there are also lots of anti-left people who are also anti-state. They just grab the near, like, I don't like the public schools that teach left-wing stuff, or I don't like the public schools because I'm Milton Friedman and they're government schools and they shouldn't be in that business. And you could use both interchangeably, in a debate, and it was fine. I agree. The right is having a big anti-left moment at the expense of all of its anti-statism, and it's really problematic. But at the same time, um, the history of anti-liberalism in this, I mean, like, you're right. I take your point. Hamilton was in favor of we can call it a big government approach to, industrial policy, right? That kind of thing, right? But there was still, I think all the founders believed, certainly that's my sense from like even the bad ones who were the Confederates and wanted to, being, the slaveholders, they believe in limited government. And there is, in the rhetoric and in the writings of a lot of people on the left, there is no limiting principle to the role of government, which is, and this is the thing that I think gets at the heart of my point about the illiberalism of the right being a response to the illiberalism of the left. The people who hate you, not you personally, but the people who hate your side the most are the ones who pay the most attention. And so the right-wingers read this crazy stuff the left-wingers say, and they say, aha, this is what they believe. And the left-wingers read the crazy stuff the crazies on the right say and say, aha, that's what they believe. And you end up having a culture war fight between two massive caricatures of the craziest nuts on each side. And that's how you get, as my friend David French, often likes to point out, you get a culture war situation where each side of the culture war thinks they lose every time, which just logically cannot be true, right? And so anyway, I think that there's a real dialectical thing to where the right's catastrophism comes from. And catastrophism is the real enemy of our politics. If you actually believe we're one election away from the end of America, even though I credit you, you might be right this time, right? But people have been saying this forever. It gives you permission to, first of all, once you lose, to give up, right? Well, I said it's all over if we lose. We lost, so I might as well just go with the flow now. But it also it gives you permission to cut corners, to do things that are illiberal, that are against the rules, because if it's an existential, extinction level event crisis, then that's how you give up on liberalism, right? That's at the very Lincolnian point. And so what concerns me is if you tell everybody that Trump will be a dictator, it gives Trump, because he has got a lizard brain, he says, well, they said if I'm elected, I'm going to be a dictator. I got elected. I must have a mandate to be a freaking dictator, right? The catastrophization is something that is really corrosive to liberalism, because liberalism is, as much as anything, is an act of faith that the rules work and apply even when you lose. So what do you think of it?
I think I would be more susceptible to this criticism if I'm not, first of all, I'm not the one who's going to give up. I'm the one, I'm trying not to give up. The people who've
Sure.
given up are dozens of Republican, hundreds of Republican operatives who know that Trump is a threat and don't say anything about anything and are hoping that they can get a job in the next Trump administration. I don't know what to, I don't feel like I have to defend I've never said that there's 100% chance, as you note, that this is what Donald Trump is. But I'm sorry, he's already, based on his actions already, we know enough to know that he is a real risk. Look, if he had succeeded, if Mike Pence had, I know I don't have to say this to you, Jonah, but I'm going to say it anyway.
No, you should say it.
If Mike
you've
Pence,
been very generous in dealing with my nitpicks, so
no, not at all, and they're not nitpicks.
Free range to make your case.
They're legitimate. They're legitimate questions to be raising. But if Mike Pence had not, found the backbone at the right moment, Trump would have been ruling as a dictator. Okay, he tried to be a dictator once. They know, his people knew that he had not won that election. He was trying to stay in power anyway. That's what a dictator is. So, I don't know what to say when people say, you're being too extreme, you're being too catastrophic. I don't have, you and I both have spent a lot of time studying American history. And there have been times in American history when people have tried to become dictators, although it's pretty rare. This is a rare, rare moment. And I think that people, for all kinds of reasons, by the way, to some extent, Democrats and the left for sure, are trying to treat this like it's just a variation of everything we've seen before. And as you say, and this is what's so bad about the Democrats on the left, there are a lot of people out there who go, see, we've been telling you since Reagan that they were going to do this. And one of the things, I know that you don't want to, you're unhappy about what I'm saying about conservatives, but I'll tell you who's going to be, if anybody pays attention, who's going to be unhappy. When I say that George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan were themselves both liberal conservatives who really, when you remind people what Bush did on immigration, Bush was a real liberal. And so I'm trying to say it isn't just, because you Democrats are being partisan. So it's like, yeah, look at the Republican Party. We've been saying it for years. They're right to say that these strains existed, but they're wrong when they don't realize that this is something totally new. So that's why if you go out and ask these kids, in the Palestinian encampments, they all say, yeah, we don't care if Trump gets elected. I mean, this is this is where we are right now. That there's no understanding of what's different about this moment, and that is the thing that's driving me crazy. And so I don't mind. Believe me, nothing would make me happier than to be wrong. I would love to be the biggest fool in the next Trump administration. I would like to be held up to ridicule because Trump is behaving so well as president. I will gladly bear that cross, okay, so to speak. But I think if ever there was a moment to be worried, this is a moment to be worried. And I don't think I need to explain my worry. What people need to explain to me is why they're not acting as if they're worried.
I think that's certainly fair. I really do. And and I do think you're stuck in a little bit of, and I am too, to a certain extent. But Democrats and liberal pundits in particular are stuck with a real cry wolf problem, right? I mean, people take offense when you say you're crying wolf.
I don't think I have a cry wolf problem. I've never warned about dictatorship before.
No. That's totally fair. My point is that you're walking into something where if I were to talk to someone just at CPAC, right, or at a Trump rally, and I were to characterize your argument, this is the problem: is like the transitive property of criticism. Is that, well, that's what they always say, and I was like, yeah, but not this guy, right? But the problem is, they did say Ronald Reagan would be a fascist dictator. They didn't say that Richard Nixon would be. They did. They go down the list.
I know.
And people always forget that the moral of the cry wolf story is that eventually there is a wolf, right? I mean, that's the point. And so I'm with you on that. I do think, and this is back in the realm of agreement, but I am more skeptical that Trump has. I think he has certainly the desires, right? I think it's really the instincts and the desires and the narcissism to try to be a dictator. I just don't think he's got say what you will about some of history's great dictators. They were long-term thinkers, right? I mean, they can think a couple steps ahead. I don't think Trump can. I think the greater danger about a potential Trump, quote unquote, dictatorship, or without the quotes, is that anybody of actual liberal conviction has abandoned him. Right, it would not, and let's not even put it that way, because I do think there will be some decent people who would go into a Trump administration, and become Pence's when push came to shove. The problem is,
I'd love to list of those people that you're thinking of.
They're few and far between, but they exist. I mean, I don't think Mike Pompeo would usher in.
On Mike Pompeo, all I hear about is Mike Pompeo. Now Mike Pompeo's going to save us.
I'm not saying he's going to save us. No, I'm not saying he's going to save us. The point I was getting at was that Trump now wants to sniff out any closet liberals, right? Any closet decent people, and surround himself with people. And this is my theory about Kristi Noem bragging about shooting a puppy, is that it's a way to demonstrate that she's willing to do anything for this guy. Yeah, that's what scares me, is like he's looking for yes men, and he didn't have as many as he wanted in the first administration, and he regrets it, and he's very clear about this, is that he's going to bring in a bunch of yes men who indulge his worst instincts. And that's how you kind of get the dictatorship, is now there are the Praetorians that will help the dictator.
Well, no, right. But also, the thing about Trump, right, he's not going to become a dictator because he's going to say, I want to be a dictator, and this is how I collect the power ministries and all this kind of stuff. I totally agree with you. He's a dictator because he's a spoiled child narcissist of a high order who wants what he wants. And the question is, when he wants what he wants, does somebody tell him he can't have it? And clearly, at least at some degree, although not as much as I think they would like to have us believe, but let's say that the adults in the room in his first term told him, no, you can't do that, Mr. President, or slow rolled him, or etc. But, his desire, and this is something that, who's the author of Blowback? Miles something.
Miles Taylor?
Miles Taylor, that he's written about, Trump, like any president, has already discovered that the one area where he has pretty much blank check is in deploying the military at home and
Hmm.
abroad. And Taylor documents all kinds of cases where he basically wanted to turn Homeland Security into his private army, et cetera, et cetera. And, various different Trump officials, including the head of Homeland Security, was sort of like slow rolling him all the time. And your point is exactly right. So this time, when he wants what he wants and he wants to deploy the military for this or he wants to do that, he's not going to have somebody to say no to him. And by the way, it ain't going to be Mike Pompeo either. And so that is one thing, and that's just Trump. But I think what I'm trying to add to that, and that is because I wouldn't have written the book if that were the only point to make, right?
Hmm.
The thing to add to that is that there are a significant number of people, including people who will be in the administration, who have real ends in mind for how they would like to see American government and society shaped. They're pretty frank about it now, but I think they would be even more frank about it then. There's no question that there is a degree of, I don't call these words are all so clumsy that I hate to use them, but you know what I mean. I'm going to just say white Christian nationalism in the sense of wishing to infuse more Christianity into the government. I don't
Hmm.
think that's just a dream of Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule. I think there are people who will try to implement that in various different ways around the margins, but nevertheless in ways that I think are fundamentally anti-liberal. And I think, you've got a lot of people coming in who, the vengeance thing is a big part of what's going
Hmm.
on here. Let me tell you something. There is no one more vengeful than a professional conservative, because as you have indicated, they've been living a life of hell in so many different ways for the past 40 years in academia, in Washington, in liberal dominated spaces. They're really very angry. And I think there is a certain amount of revenge that they would like also. And so you might not care if you had a president or an administration who was not in that business anyway, but think of all the ways in which Trump being in the White House, and people should not underestimate, if he actually wins the presidency, any hint of resistance that currently exists in the Republican Party, which, by the way, is already vanishingly small,
Hmm.
is simply going to disappear when he is president of the United States. And so, why people should not see what's risky about giving this man that much power is I don't again you explain to me why you're not worried about. I'm not you, but I want to know
Hmm.
why you're not worried about that. And don't tell me
Yeah.
that Joe Biden is going to destroy our country as we know.
Yeah. Again, the recency
I know.
bias thing. I mean, it's maddening. Just since we just kept touching on it and didn't get at it, you know, your day job is about grand foreign policy stuff and all these kinds of things. Where do you see the Israel Hamas situation going, and how worried are you about the campus stuff here making Biden? How do you think Biden has handled all of these things domestically and internationally? And then I'll let you go.
Biden's foreign policy wouldn't have been my choice in many respects on many issues, and it's complicated because, first of all, this Israel-Gaza crisis would have confounded any president. The structure of American politics, especially now that there is so much more sympathy, which there didn't used to be on the on the Palestinian side. It's a no-win situation for the president. I think either he had to, you could say you should choose A or B. A is you let the Israelis do it for a month and then you say, that's it, we're done, you're done, call it a day. That was one way to go. He would have gotten murdered, politically from all kinds of quarters if he had done that. The other way of doing it is we're all in. The Israeli, as Tom Cotton says, let the rubble bounce. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that Biden has chosen a path in the middle strikes me as exactly what 99.9% of presidents would have done in this situation. So that means the United States is basically unable to bring this to an end. And so it'll happen. I assume it'll go on until the Israelis are exhausted doing it. I suppose that's probably the answer. I can't predict what's happening politically in Israel because I
Hmm.
know that we in the United States underestimate the degree to which Israelis are unified, around this issue. So I think the United States is basically powerless to stop it, even not theoretically, but actually.
Right.
And so it'll go on until Israel is tired of doing it. And the Iran element means that the United States is not going to stop arming Israel. I think Iran did Israel, gave bought what I don't know. I say this because I don't know what Netanyahu really wants to do, but I
Hmm.
think if he wants to do stuff, Iran bought him a lot of more time to do it. So as a political matter, that was not the answer to it. Oh, and as
And then
far as
there's
this
just.
protest, I do, but this I really do want to emphasize because we talked about this before.
Mhm.
Can we not believe that our country is falling apart because there are student protests? Can we not believe that the end is nigh because there are student protests? This is a failure of the university administrations, and this has almost nothing to do with whether you think that the protests are justified or not. The university has an obligation to maintain itself as a bastion of liberalism, and it
Hmm.
has singularly failed to do that. As we talked about before we started, my poor father had been fighting this battle. He gave a speech once to insist, just as a private citizen at the apartheid encampments that they had on Beinecke Plaza in Yale. So this is something universities have brought on themselves. And again, irrespective of what you think about the merits of the protests themselves.
Yeah, I actually think the most significant protest as a microcosm of these themes wasn't Columbia 68 or Berkeley 64, 65. It was the guns on campus crisis at Cornell,
Mm.
where you actually
Which
had
was
people
where my
on
son was
campus,
there.
yeah, with guns,
Yeah.
who, and the administration basically caved to it, and poor Clinton Rossiter got it coming and going, and anyway, it's kind of a tragic story. Anyway, I can talk about that another time. Robert Kagan, thank you so much for doing this. I am very generous for the mensch-like collegiality with which you came here to be subjected to my blistering queries, and I hope you'll come back.
Always, I was delighted to talk to you about this stuff, and I'm happy to have this dialogue. Honestly, if it can be had as it was here in an intelligent and friendly fashion.
Fair enough.